Hey guys, this is Patrick Hall with Fstoppers.com, and today I'm going to show you how you can make your time lapses significantly better by slowing down your shutter considerably. So here we are back at the Four Corners of Law. This is at Meeting Street and Broad Street, and if you saw the previous video I did, I showed you how you guys can use a 15-stop neutral density filter to create a really unique photograph where the sky is really blurred and the cars are almost non-existent in the photo. Today we've just changed corners and I'm actually shooting back at the courthouse here. And interesting little fact, the architect who designed the White House actually designed this courthouse years before the White House, and you can actually see quite a resemblance in both buildings. So since I live in a touristy town and this is like an iconic intersection, it makes sense to shoot this building because a lot of people want time lapses of this. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get my tripod, I'm gonna set up on these steps, and my goal is to shoot a little higher so that I don't get the foot traffic walking right in front of my camera while still being able to frame up an interesting shot with a wide angle lens. So I've basically got my camera set up here on a tripod, and like I said, I came up these steps. I'm actually going to extend this head a little bit. And my thought is just, I want to have enough clearance to where if people are walking right in front of my camera, they don't actually block the lens ever. So I think this is a good place to be set up. And I'm going to get my composition fairly wide. I'm going to try to keep everything as straight as possible, but I'm going to show you how you can straighten things up in Premiere if you need to. I'm going to pre-focus. And basically the idea I have here is I want to get as long of a shutter as I can so that there's a lot of motion in the cars. Let me first just take some video, and then we'll speed that up so that you can see how bad it looks when you have a really fast shutter. So I'm just gonna flip my camera into live view. I'm shooting at like a 24th of a second. I'm just gonna hit record. I'm just gonna let this run for a few minutes, and then we'll speed this up so you can see what a video time lapse would look like. All right, so as you can see, this time lapse does not look good. The cars are whizzing by and it just looks really jarring. When I see these kind of time lapses on television, it just kind of makes me cringe because I know how much better it can look if you add a little bit of motion to the cars by slowing your shutter. So let's now go back to the camera and let's see if we can slow the shutter down by taking photographs. So what I want to do is I'm going to go here and set my ISO all the way to the lowest setting, and on this camera, the D850, that's around ISO 32. And then I'm going to take my aperture all the way down to f22, and what f22 is going to allow me to do is get the longest possible shutter because I've closed the aperture all the way down. So right now it's about 5 o'clock, and the slowest shutter I think I can get while getting a correct exposure is about 1/3 of a second. So let me go ahead and take this photograph. And as you can see, that's a pretty good exposure. So what I'm going to do now is put my camera into intervalometer mode. And what that's going to allow me to do is just set the camera, let it take a bunch of pictures in a row, and then when I'm done, I'm going to have a ton of photos I can throw into Premiere and create a time lapse. So I'm just going to go into menu, and then on the D850, it's under the camera setting. I'm going to scroll down to interval timer shooting, and I'm going to set the interval to 1 second. Since I'm shooting right around a second, I'm shooting at 1/3 of a second. And then I'm just going to hit start. Now, if you don't have an intervalometer in your camera, you can always buy an external intervalometer that will plug into the side of your camera, and then you can control it from there. Now, you're probably wondering how many photos do you need to take to make, say, a 10-second time lapse? Well, I'm going to show you the math that you can use on your phone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate this to be 1 second. Even though it's 1/3 of a second, I'm going to round up to 1 second because that's the time it takes with the blackout of the curtain and the shutter flipping up. So I'm going to take 1 second. I'm going to multiply that by 24 frames per second. And then I want this to be about 10 seconds long. So that gives me 240 seconds. We divide that by 60. So I know this is going to take me 4 minutes to get the time lapse. Super easy math. You can do it right on your calculator. And now what I'm going to do is set a timer for 4 minutes, hit start, and I'm simply going to wait. So my time lapse just finished, and as we watch this, it's still pretty jarring. In my opinion, there's not enough of a blur with the cars and the people walking by. In my experience shooting time lapses, the ideal sweet spot really is about a 2-second exposure. And if we zoom into any one of these frames and look at the actual motion blur from 1/3 of a second, you can see it's just really not enough to give that nice fluid motion that we desire. Now, the other big thing you're going to notice is because I'm shooting on a DSLR with an electronic shutter in my lens, we're getting a lot of flicker in this time lapse. And the only real way to get around that is to either use a manual lens that has a manual aperture that you can lock down, or you can actually shoot at 2.8 or the widest aperture of your lens so that your aperture blades are not constantly stepping down every time it takes a picture. You may not know this, but DSLRs are actually really inaccurate when it comes to choosing an aperture over and over and over again. And as you can see in this time lapse, the aperture is changing just enough to give us that flicker. So in order to create a nice time lapse with no flicker and to get the long shutter that I need, I'm gonna wanna shoot at the wide open aperture on this lens, which is 2.8. But at 2.8 in this environment, it's just going to be way too bright. So I'm gonna have to add a lot of neutral density to get this exposure back where it was at f/22 when I'm shooting at 2.8. So if you watched my previous video where I tried to take a single photograph with a very long exposure, I was using a 15-stop neutral density filter by the company Polar Pro. Now, they also sent us a 10-stop neutral density filter that also has a polarizer attached to it. This is called the ND1000PL. And I think that this filter is going to work a little bit better because I really don't need 15 stops of neutral density filter. I probably need between 8 and 10, so I think this is going to be perfect. So I'm gonna go ahead and add this filter to the front of the lens. Now, because this neutral density filter is 10 stops instead of the 15 stops I used in the previous video, I can actually autofocus through this filter. So if I put the camera into live view and I bump the ISO up a lot, I can actually focus. And then what I want to do is turn my autofocus off so that it locks the focus. Now keep in mind, I'm shooting at 2.8 to prevent any kind of aperture flicker, and I need to make sure that my focus is perfect. When you're shooting at f8, f16, f22, you're gonna have everything in focus, but when you're shooting at f2.8, even at 24 millimeters, you really wanna make sure that you nail your focus. So for this shot, I'm going to focus on the crosswalk right in the middle of the street. And now what I want to do is, with live view on, I want to actually rotate this polarizer. And as you can see through the camera, it makes a pretty extreme effect. I can change the look of the windows and the building across the way, and I can also really darken the skies. Now, in my opinion, if I polarize to 100%, it's making the skies look way too dark. It almost looks like a fake HDR image. So I'm going to kind of split the difference and polarize the sky just a little bit. And since I don't have any water here, I don't think it's making a huge difference, but it is giving me a really punchy blue sky. So now that I have my neutral density in place and I've picked the correct polarization, now it's time to find the correct exposure that I want. So I'm gonna set my ISO as low as it goes. That's already at ISO 32. I'm already at f2.8, which is the widest aperture on this lens. And now I'm able to take my shutter all the way to 2 seconds. And if I take a test shot here, as you can see from this example, I have a lot more blur in the cars. The people walking by are almost completely blurred. And I think when I take a full time lapse, this is going to look way better than the previous time lapse we used at 1/3 of a second. So now I'm gonna go back into my menu. I'm gonna go back to interval shooting mode. I have to change my interval now to 2 seconds. And I'm gonna hit start. So I'm gonna set the timer to 12 minutes, and I'm just gonna enjoy being in the shade because it's actually pretty hot out here. Now, while this camera is clicking away for the next few minutes, let's talk about creating even longer exposure times. You might think that having exposure times of 10 seconds or 30 seconds or maybe even a full minute would create even more dramatic time lapses. And the problem with that is, if you do the math, you'll find that you can easily stay out here for 40 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, just to get one single time lapse if you choose a shutter speed that's too long. The other problem with shooting time lapses with long shutter speeds and really dense neutral density filters is that because each exposure takes so long to capture, 5, 10, 30 seconds, the clouds in your scene are going to fly by really quickly, and it gives you a lot less control on how much you can speed up the time lapse. At some point, if your skies are moving really quickly, it kind of looks a little too fake in my opinion, and it takes a long time to capture those shots. So for me personally, I find that 2 seconds is the sweet spot. Long exposures can look great in still photographs, but typically they don't really look that good in time lapse. Now here's an example I just shot here in Charleston of the bridge where I used a 10-second exposure to capture really smooth water, and I thought this would create a really awesome time lapse. But as you can see, the water still has kind of a jarring effect. While every single frame is really smooth, when you stack all of those frames on top of each other and play them back in a video, it just doesn't really look that good. And as you can see, the clouds are just whizzing by. So there's the chance that you could create something with these longer shutter speeds, But again, I feel like the 2-second shutter is the absolute sweet spot for a time lapse. Now there is one feature on the D850 and a few of the newer cameras that I want to mention because people in the comments are going to bring it up. And that is, some of these cameras allow you to shoot time lapses directly in the camera without constantly opening and shutting the aperture blades. If I go to the menu and instead of going to the camera mode where the intervalometer is and I go down to the video mode, I can actually choose time-lapse movie. And here I'm going to choose a 2-second interval, and then I'm going to hit start. And as you hear, the camera is going to flip the mirror up, it's going to set the aperture, and it's going to now silently pull frames off of the exposed sensor. So there's absolutely no moving parts on the camera whatsoever right now. And the nice thing about this is it completely removes any aperture flicker that your camera might introduce through the lens. So I actually now could shoot at f8 instead of f2.8, which is going to allow me to get much more depth of field than I was getting in the previous example. Now, if you're able to use this feature, it's going to allow you to stop down to say f8, maybe even f22, but because it's so bright out here, even at those smaller aperture settings, you're still not going to get long enough of a shutter to give that nice natural blur. What it will allow you to do, however, is to probably use a neutral density filter that's not quite as dense as 10 stops. So you might be able to get away with a less dense neutral density filter like a 4-stop or a 6-stop. So now that we have all of our images captured, let's head into the post-production studio where I can show you how to build your final time-lapse. All right guys, so here we are in the post-production studio, and I just want to quickly show you how you can take a bunch of JPEGs, throw them into Premiere, and export a time-lapse really seamlessly. So I just have a project here, and I want to open up a new sequence. So let me show you how you can do that. You can come down here to hit New Item. Let's go to Sequence, and then instead of choosing a preset, I'm actually going to go to Settings, and I'm going to make my own sequence. So I'm going to make one that's 4K, so we're going to type in 3840 by 2160. You want to make sure it's 23.976 frames per second. Hit OK. So now that we have our sequence made, let's go ahead and drag over our file. So I just have all of the JPEG images in this folder called time-lapse example. So I'm just going to drag this over and let that import. And now that our folder is imported, let's go ahead and select all of the JPEGs. Now you want to make sure that they're all in the correct order numerically so that no image is out of order. Otherwise you will see a big jump in your time lapse. And let me go ahead and move this over here. And we're just going to select the first JPEG and drag all of them into our timeline. Now on this computer, if I hit the forward step 1 frame button, you're going to notice that every single image takes up only 1 frame. So let me show you a setting that you need to adjust so that every one of these images imports as 1 single frame. So what you want to do is go to Edit, Preferences, and then we go all the way down here to Timeline. And on Timeline, you want to make sure that this one's still image default duration is set to 1 and frames. So that's going to allow all of your images to import only being 1 single frame, and then when you hit spacebar, it's going to play it back with each one being a frame. If you do not do this, it might import your images and they might be like 10 frames or 20 frames, and you're gonna get that stop motion look. So make sure you definitely change that setting in Premiere. So now that we have the images imported, we just wanna select one of them, and we wanna go up here to Scale, and I just wanna scale my image down so that the entire photo is in place. I'm going to right-click Motion, copy this, and then I'm going to paste that onto all of my other images. So now when I hit play, it's going to play back the time lapse with all of the images scaled to fit into our 4K sequence. From here, I now want to right-click all of our images and hit Nest. So now that we have all of our images nested into a single sequence, we can now throw some effects on a single sequence and actually adjust everything from here. So the first thing I want to do is, I told you guys I would show you how you can fix these converging lines that were caused by the wide angle lens. So I'm going to go over here to the effects search bar, and I'm going to type in corner pin, and I'm going to throw the corner pin onto this nested sequence. And then from here I'm going to go to the upper left, and I'm just going to start tweaking this to where I can pull these lines and make them vertical. Maybe come down to the lower left, play with that just a little bit. And something like that looks pretty good. Now, obviously, these adjustments aren't quite as good as what you can do in Photoshop, but it's a quick little trick that you can do if you find that you have some angles that are really off in your verticals. So now that I have all of that done, I'm going to add one final keyframe to this just to give this some motion. So I'm going to add keyframes on the position and scale. And for this one, let's zoom in. I'm going to go to the end of my sequence and add another set of keyframes. And let's just zoom this in maybe like 110%. And so then now when I go back and play the final sequence, you're just going to have this nice little zoom in with all of our verticals pretty close to being straight. I want to thank Polar Pro for sending us a few of these neutral density filters. If you guys want to get your own copy of this, head over to the Polar Pro website, and they actually have a really interesting buyback program where you can send in your old filter and get up to $40 back on the purchase of a brand new filter. So definitely take advantage of that. So I hope this video was informative and you can see why it's really important to have a few different neutral density filters in your bag for both still photographs, for video, and for time lapses. If you enjoy this kind of content, head over to fstoppers.com where we have articles every day on photography, and make sure you subscribe to our channel below so that you get the updates as soon as we release a new video. If you want to learn from some of the best photographers in the world, head over to fstoppers.com/store where you can check out our full-length tutorials. All right, so I decided to stay out here till sunset. So this is the final time lapse that I made. This is pretty cool.